this episode, we're going to make sense of lineage and traceability, two ideas that sound like paperwork until you realize they are the reason you can trust an AI-driven security workflow on a bad day. Lineage is the story of where data came from and how it moved and changed over time. Traceability is your ability to follow that story in both directions, from a final result back to the original sources, and from a raw source forward to every place it was used. When beginners hear this, they sometimes assume it is only for auditors, but in security, it is also for responders and engineers who need answers quickly and confidently. If you cannot trace a model output back to evidence, you cannot defend it, debug it, or safely automate anything around it. Once you build real lineage and traceability, the model becomes easier to use responsibly because every output can be explained as a consequence of specific inputs and controlled transformations. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to understand lineage is to compare it to a food ingredient label rather than a mystery stew. If you eat something and feel sick, you want to know what was in it, where it came from, and which steps might have introduced contamination. Security data pipelines are similar, especially when they feed an AI system. Raw data might come from alerts, logs, tickets, vulnerability scans, or human notes, and each source has its own reliability and quirks. Along the way, data often gets filtered, redacted, normalized, deduplicated, enriched, summarized, and transformed into formats that are easier to store or analyze. Without lineage, those steps blur together, and you end up with conclusions that cannot be tied to anything concrete. With lineage, you can say exactly which raw records were used, which transformations were applied, and why the final model artifact looks the way it does. Traceability matters because AI outputs often sit in the middle of decisions rather than at the end. A model might produce a risk label, a summary, or a recommendation that then triggers a workflow like escalation, notification, or investigation. If that workflow later goes wrong, you need to answer questions that start simple and quickly become very specific. Which events did the model see, and which did it miss? Did a cleaning step remove a timestamp or host name that would have changed the conclusion? Did a redaction step hide the one detail that connected two events? Traceability lets you answer these questions without guessing, because the pipeline keeps a map of dependencies. In security, the difference between a controlled system and a chaotic one is often whether you can reconstruct why a decision happened in the first place. To build lineage, you start at the raw source and assign stable identities to the data you ingest. The raw record is your anchor, and it should have metadata that stays attached as the data moves through the pipeline. That metadata includes where it came from, when it was collected, what system produced it, and what trust level it has. If you later create a clean version, a summarized version, or a derived feature, each derived item should retain a pointer back to the raw record or records that produced it. Beginners sometimes think a pointer is optional, but it is the core of traceability. It is how you make sure the nice, compact representation can always be tied back to evidence. Without those links, the derived dataset becomes a separate reality, and models trained or prompted on it become difficult to audit. A practical and beginner-friendly principle is that every transformation should be recorded as an explicit step rather than an invisible side effect. When data is normalized, you record what was normalized and what the original value was. When duplicates are collapsed, you record the fact that collapse happened and the count of items that were collapsed. When enrichment adds context, you record which source supplied the enrichment and what lookup logic was used. This is not because you expect perfection, but because you expect surprises. If an incident investigation reveals that a certain field was consistently missing, you want to know whether it was missing at the source or removed later by your own pipeline. Recording transformations turns your pipeline into an explainable sequence rather than a black box. Lineage becomes even more important once you move from data into model artifacts, which include training datasets, evaluation datasets, prompt templates, embeddings, indexes, fine-tuning files, and model versions. A model artifact is any object that influences what the model outputs. either by shaping its learned behavior or by shaping the context it sees at inference time. If you retrain or update an artifact without good lineage, you may not be able to reproduce past behavior, which is dangerous in security because you need consistent decision logic. You also may not be able to prove what data was included, which matters for sensitive information such as personally identifiable information, PII, or internal secrets. When you track lineage from raw sources to artifacts, you can answer whether a specific record was included, whether it was redacted first, and whether it should be removed later due to retention policies. Traceability is not only about data content, it is also about versions and timing, because AI systems change over time. A model version might change, a prompt template might change, a retrieval index might be rebuilt, or a cleaning rule might be updated. Even if the raw data stays the same, these changes can alter outputs. If you see a shift in model behavior, you need to know which change likely caused it. That is why traceability includes versioning of code, configuration, schemas, and transformation rules. It also includes recording when a change took effect and which outputs were produced under which version. For a beginner, the big idea is simple. You cannot reliably explain or debug a system that forgets its own history. Traceability is how the system remembers what it did. A classic security failure mode is making the pipeline more convenient and accidentally making it less accountable. For example, someone might manually copy data from one system to another to save time, or they might paste key evidence into a document to share quickly. Those shortcuts can break lineage because they detach evidence from its original metadata and context. Once that happens, the model may be analyzing an isolated snippet without the surrounding facts that gave it meaning. Responsible design tries to keep automated, logged paths for moving data, even when people are in a hurry. When human handoffs are unavoidable, you can still preserve lineage by attaching source identifiers and collection time, and by treating the copied content as lower trust until verified. This helps your system remain resilient under stress, which is exactly when you most need reliable traceability. Another important dimension is the relationship between lineage and security controls. Good lineage does not replace access control, but it makes access control easier to enforce and audit. If you know where sensitive fields originated and where they flow, you can restrict those flows. If you know which datasets include certain categories of data, you can limit who can access them and under what purpose. If a user requests deletion or if a retention rule requires removal, Lineage tells you all the downstream places that data might still exist, including derived datasets and model artifacts. Without Lineage, deletion becomes wishful thinking, because you might remove a record from one database while it remains embedded in another system's cache or training file. With Lineage, deletion becomes a concrete set of steps that can be verified. Lineage also supports better reasoning about trust, because not all sources are equally reliable and not all transformations are equally safe. If the model's conclusion relies heavily on a low-trust source, your system should know that and treat the conclusion as less authoritative. If a particular transformation is known to be lossy, such as aggressive summarization, your system should record that loss so users do not assume the data is complete. Traceability turns trust into something you can measure and carry forward rather than something you guess based on vibes. This is especially helpful for beginners because it prevents the trap of treating all model outputs as equally confident. When the model output is tied to a chain of evidence with known quality, you can calibrate your use of the output more responsibly. When you build lineage well, you also unlock safer verification patterns. If a model generates a summary, you can check each key statement against the specific raw records that support it. If a model produces a classification, you can sample the underlying evidence and see whether the classification matches the reality of those events. If a model's behavior changes after an update, you can compare outputs across versions using the same source inputs and see exactly what drift occurred. These are not academic exercises. They are day-to-day safety practices that keep automation from becoming brittle. The reason they work is that traceability makes verification cheap. If you have to hunt manually for supporting logs every time, verification gets skipped. When the links are built in, verification becomes a normal part of the workflow. It is also worth addressing a beginner misunderstanding about privacy and traceability, because people sometimes think traceability means keeping everything forever. Good traceability does not require infinite retention. What it requires is knowing what you had, where it went, and when it was removed. You can track lineage with identifiers and metadata even after content is deleted, as long as you do it thoughtfully and within policy. The goal is not to preserve sensitive content for curiosity, but to preserve accountability for decisions. In fact, traceability can improve privacy because it helps you enforce minimization and retention rules more reliably. If you know every copy and derivative, you can delete with confidence instead of hoping you found all the places data might hide. Another practical point is that lineage and traceability reduce the impact of mistakes by shrinking the time to diagnosis. If the model produces an incorrect or harmful output, you want to find the root cause quickly. Was the input data incorrect? Was the cleaning step too aggressive? Was the retrieval process pulling the wrong document? Was the model version changed without the team noticing? Traceability gives you a disciplined way to answer those questions in order because it provides a map of dependencies. You do not start with blame, you start with evidence about the pipeline. This is an important cultural benefit too, because teams are more willing to adopt AI systems when they know failures can be investigated and corrected systematically. As you become more comfortable with these concepts, you will notice that lineage and traceability are also about being able to say no safely. If someone asks why a particular decision was made, you can answer with evidence rather than defensiveness. If someone proposes using a dataset for a new purpose, you can evaluate whether the lineage supports that purpose and whether the consent, trust, and retention policies still apply. If someone wants to quickly train a model on a pile of tickets, you can point out that without provenance and traceability, you cannot guarantee sensitive data is controlled or removed later. In security, the ability to say no with reasons is as important as the ability to say yes quickly. Traceability gives you those reasons in a grounded, auditable form. By the end of this episode, the central takeaway should feel like a solid engineering truth rather than an abstract governance slogan. If you cannot trace it, you cannot trust it. And if you cannot explain it, you cannot safely automate it. Lineage starts with anchoring raw sources with stable identities and metadata, then preserving links as data is cleaned, transformed, and enriched. Traceability extends that discipline to model artifacts, versions, and downstream workflows so you can reproduce behavior and investigate drift. Together, they make AI systems safer because they turn outputs into accountable conclusions rather than persuasive guesses. When the next incident hits and time pressure rises, that accountability is what keeps your AI pipeline from becoming another source of uncertainty.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.